Why did the producers of The Walking Dead file a lawsuit against AMC, the studio behind the hit series? What are modified adjusted gross receipts, and how do they relate to this lawsuit? What can a lawsuit involving a flesh-eating zombie show teach us about contract drafting and negotiation? Stay tuned and find out on this episode of Reels and Gavels. In 2017, a number of producers of the acclaimed zombie survival television series, The Walking Dead, sued AMC, the studio producer behind the series. The allegations were that AMC cheated these producers out of their share of profits derived from exploitation of the hit TV show. For reference, at the time of the lawsuit, The Walking Dead was the biggest series on television and was breaking all sorts of viewership records. So why did the producers feel that they were cheated out of their share of revenue from the series? Well, the contracts these producers entered into with AMC before they even started working on the series, failed to define the term MAGR or MAGR. MAGR is short for Modified Adjusted Gross Receipts. Whenever you have someone like a producer sharing the profits of a piece of media, such as a television program, you allocate the profits based on the definition of Modified Adjusted Gross Receipts. The MAGR is broadly defined as the project revenues or income the studio receives for exploiting the television program, minus the expenses of producing, marketing, and distributing the program. For example, let's say it costs $3 million to produce an episode of a television show. Then let's say the studio producing the show sells the rights to broadcast the show to TBS, for example. Let's imagine TBS pays a licensing fee to the studio of $3 million per episode in order to gain that right to broadcast the show on their network. Using a very simple version of the MAGR definition, the profits to be shared by all the revenue sharing parties would be $0 at this point because the expenses and the revenue are equal. Then imagine the studio sells a bunch of t-shirts based on the series and Blu-ray discs and makes about another $1 million in merchandising profits. If nothing else is added to the formula, then the studio would have roughly a $1 million net gain in their profits because of the additional $1 million. This $1 million gain is what's then allocated between the revenue sharing parties such as the producers or possibly the writers or some of the actors, subject to various other deductions and calculations that I'm not going to get into right now, but you get the general idea. Determining what else is added to this formula is what negotiating MAGR is all about. So the studio usually wants the definition to include as many expenses as possible so that they can deduct these from the profits they have to share with others. While the producers or any of the other revenue sharing parties, they want to increase the number of revenue streams while not deducting expenses in order to maximize the net gain and their own profit as a result. So let's get back to AMC and The Walking Dead. The central problem in this case is the parties never defined MAGR. The parties agreed MAGR shall be defined using AMC's standard MAGR definition, but nobody knew what that definition was. In other words, the producers of The Walking Dead seemingly agreed that whatever definition of MAGR AMC used in its other production agreements would be fine in this case. AMC the studio, not to be confused with AMC the network, was an entirely new venture at the time The Walking Dead was being first created around 2010. In fact, The Walking Dead was AMC Studios' first production, which meant AMC did not have a standard definition of MAGR. AMC was still trying to figure out what the definition of MAGR should be when they were entering into these agreements. But while all this was going on, The Walking Dead producers had already signed their agreements. Whatever AMC decided its standard MAGR definition would be, the producers had already agreed to it. AMC the studio wasn't going to get a hefty licensing fee for selling the series to some network such as TBS or USA because it was creating the series for its own affiliated AMC network. So there was no licensing fee to cover the cost of production, as is typically the case. If each episode of The Walking Dead cost $2 million to produce, the net profits to be shared between the producers would be starting at negative $2 million. That is to say, the MAGR definition would be starting at a significant deficit. AMC would have to sell an incredible amount of merchandise in order to overcome that kind of deficit. The television industry, however, has a solution to this unfair situation of a studio essentially selling a series to itself. The solution is an imputed license fee. An imputed license fee is a figure added to the MAGR definition that represents an estimate of the amount of money a network like AMC would have paid an outside studio like MGM or Paramount Pictures for the right to broadcast episodes of a series on the AMC Network cable channel. But since AMC was free to create its own definition in this case, it was also free to come up with its own imputed license fee. The parties, the producers and AMC, never negotiated what the imputed license fee would be. And somewhat unsurprisingly, AMC decided to use a lower imputed license fee than it did for other major shows that were featured on AMC Network. A typical license fee for basic cable networks like AMC ranges anywhere from 60% to 85% of the cost of production per each episode. For example, a series like Breaking Bad, which was produced by Sony and then sold to AMC Network, brought in a license fee of roughly 85% of the production cost per episode to Sony. This fee was allegedly increased to 100% of the production cost for the 5th season of Breaking Bad. So let's say the episodes of Breaking Bad cost $3 million each to produce. Sony Pictures, the producer, was covering those costs with AMC's licensing fee so that whatever they were dividing between the profit-sharing parties was starting at least at zero and not at a negative number or a deficit. In the case of The Walking Dead, AMC decided to use an imputed license fee of 65% of the production cost of each episode, up to a production cap of $1,450,000 per episode, increasing 5% each season. So essentially this was on the low end of the estimate of what an imputed license fee could be, and pretty much a big discount from what they paid on series like Breaking Bad and Mad Men, which was also apparently in the 80% range. The producers of The Walking Dead felt cheated. The Walking Dead was arguably the biggest show on the planet, and it was definitely the biggest show on AMC ever. And yet they were getting a worse deal than the folks that worked on Mad Men and Breaking Bad. So the producers of The Walking Dead sued AMC, arguing that the court should just throw out the definition of MAGR, because it was fundamentally unfair and not what they had agreed to, at least in their opinion. They argued that AMC only decided to use a 65% production cost imputed license fee because they saw how profitable The Walking Dead would be, and they had that unilateral power to screw the other parties out of their share of profits. If the producers knew the MAGR definition would include an imputed license fee of only 65%, they would have never signed the contract. How can you agree to something without knowing what it is?
You can have the boat or the mystery box.
What, are you crazy? We'll take the boat.
No, not so fast, Lois. A boat's a boat, but the mystery box could be anything. It could even be a boat. You know how much we've wanted one of those.
Well, the court ruled that the producers did know what the definition was. It was the standard definition used by AMC, as their agreement had stated. The fact that the standard definition wasn't actually included in the agreement or didn't actually exist at the time doesn't matter. The producers essentially agreed to give AMC the unilateral right to decide what the definition would become, and they agreed to abide by that definition. So let's come up with another scenario. If instead of stating that the definition would be AMC's standard definition, the contract stated something like, the MAGR definition will be negotiated in good faith at a future date, then the contract wouldn't be enforceable, because an agreement to agree in the future isn't a legally enforceable contract when it comes to a material term. Now, what profits are going to be shared and how you define what's a profit, what's an expense, that seems like a material term for an agreement, which means it's the most important term in the agreement. If that doesn't exist, if that's not negotiated for and not included in the agreement, you don't have an agreement. But that wasn't the case here. The court also felt better about ruling against the producers because they actively negotiated a number of concessions that went into their MAGR definition, including certain merchandising and derivative rights and a most favored nation clause, which ensured that if any other producer ever got a better deal on The Walking Dead, they would get that deal retroactively as well, which shows that these producers weren't completely clueless and that their lawyers were doing their jobs and they were competent to some extent, so you can't really expect to get out of this one clause that they didn't negotiate as well as they could have. The court also found that although The Walking Dead was probably when this definition was first used, the definition has been used since consistently in similar AMC agreements, which means the MAGR definition and the 65% imputed license fee became the standard definition as a matter of company policy, which means it must be a fair definition if anyone's still doing business with AMC after all this time. It might have been a different story if AMC only used the definition for The Walking Dead producers, but apparently once it used it for The Walking Dead, it's continued to use it. So the lesson of this case study is actually quite simple. When you're negotiating a contract, it's obvious each side is out to maximize its benefits at your own expense. Anything that isn't expressly negotiated for or spelled out is going to likely lead to a dispute at some point in the future, with each side firmly believing they are right and that they deserve the larger benefit of the bargain. Even if a term isn't expressly defined, as long as there is a way to identify the definition at a future date, you will likely have an enforceable contract, and you should also assume the definition is going to be interpreted in the least favorable way possible if it's not expressly defined. But that's all I've got. Until next time, this is Reels and Gavels.
Thank you.